Marvel Comics has some really great villains, but they've also got some that they probably wish never existed, and those winners are who we are talking about today. So when Spider-Man villain The Spot showed up and announced his title, Spider-Man quite literally fell over in hysterics before getting his spider butt handed to him. But The Spot is actually a pretty cool name, especially when you compare it to our first villain of the day, Mr. Fish. Mr. Fish was originally a petty crook who was exposed to radiation while out on a job, and he then fell into the East River. He emerged from the nasty New York waters as a half-fish, half-man hybrid with pretty impressive superhuman strength. Mr. Fish may look absolutely hilarious with an even funnier name, but he managed to create his own branch of the crime family known as the Magia, and he even created a decent criminal following before Luke Cage stopped him. Despite being actually somewhat impressive though, he is just a touch bit too weird to really work as a lasting villain, and I mean, he calls himself Mr. Fish, so there's that. Moving on, Pulp Fiction villain Dr. Fu Manchu was a mad scientist and mystic created in 1913 by British novelist Sax Rohmer. The character was built on stereotypes with traits like slanted eyes, a gaunt face, silk clothing, and long fingers paired with a Halloween goatee and an insatiable desire to conquer Western society. He was made to be basically a boogeyman who epitomizes fears about Asian peoples. The character became so entrenched in society that when Marvel writer Steve Englehart and artist Jim Starlin wanted to create Shang-Chi in 1972, Marvel acquired the legal rights to Fu Manchu and made him Shang-Chi's evil father in the comic book series Master of Kung Fu in 1973. It's pretty similar to how Marvel's The Mandarin first appeared and leaned heavily into stereotypes as well. But Marvel has not had the rights to Fu Manchu since the final issue of Masters of Kung Fu in 1983, so since then, comic book writers have found roundabout solutions to Shang-Chi's father, like in Jean Luen Yang's ongoing series Shang-Chi, he is now his own entity named Shang-Tzu, but he still kept a majority of the traits that Fu Manchu had. Then there was the Shang-Chi movie, which completely changed Shang-Tzu to be an incredibly compelling, deep, and powerful character who had none of the stereotypical traits possessed by Fu Manchu, and Marvel could finally breathe a sigh of relief, even if they can't really escape the fact that they pull the racism. Now, there are only one or two characters that go by the name Belladonna in Marvel Comics. The one most people are familiar with is Belladonna Boudreaux, who is the ex-wife of the X-Men's Gambit and a member of the New Orleans Assassins Guild. But the Belladonna I'm talking about today was actually Narda Ravana, a European fashion designer. This lady Belladonna had a problem with Roderick Kingsley, who would go on to become the Spider-Man villain Hobgoblin. Now, Roderick was another famous fashion designer, only he was one that stole from other designers. Kingsley allegedly stole Ravana's designs and marketed them in the United States, stealing her success, and for that, I guess he had to pay. Swearing vengeance, Narda assumed the guise of Belladonna and put together a small group of henchmen. She used toxic gas that could dissolve Spider-Man's webs and take people's lives, and she even had her henchmen dress up as the villain the Prowler to distract Spider-Man, all for the end goal of wiping Kingsley off the face of the earth. Unfortunately though, Belladonna just didn't have the popularity needed to be a lasting villain. She got arrested in 1980 while Kingsley became the Hobgoblin, and he's been causing problems all the way up until 2020 and is bound to come back at some point as well. Armed with a hate ray, the hate monger set himself up as a notable rabble-rousing villain who enticed fear and bigotry among American citizens, specifically against visible minorities. He also caused political instability in South America, which made him an enemy of the CIA, and he gave extremely bigoted speeches in New York City, which brought him into the sights of the Fantastic Four. This all made him pretty problematic in his earlier appearances, especially given the fact that he dressed primarily in a big pointy hood evocative of a certain group of incredibly bigoted people who I don't think I can talk about on YouTube. Do you know who else I can't talk about on YouTube? A certain man with a tiny mustache from Germany who is pretty prominent in world history, and he is exactly who Hate Monger is. Or I should say, Hate Monger is a clone of that man created by Arnim Zola. Despite that, Hate Monger has been a pretty lasting villain, having gone through multiple similar costumes, multiple different bodies, and he even eventually got recreated as a being of living psychoactive energy by the Red Skull using a cosmic cube. But at the same time, he seems to be a rather obscure and little well-known villain, and I think that may be partially by design. Next up, the Spider-Man villain known as Mindworm is honestly just a really sad story. William Turner, no, not like the guy from Pirates of the Caribbean, accidentally took his mother's life using his unconscious vampiric psionic feeding abilities. This act caused his father to go into emotional shock and run in front of a car. So, as you can imagine, this was extremely upsetting for William, as he did actually deeply care for both of his parents, and he didn't even know that he was a mutant when the incident occurred. Now, William isn't even a normal Marvel mutant. His mutation was a result of an experimental compound being stored near the hospital where he was born, which resulted in his massive head, which was the butt of a lot of jokes and bullying. William grew up in an orphanage before eventually moving into a shack in New York City, where he would feed off the emotions of the nearby tenants without actually taking their lives. One of these tenants was Peter Parker, and the two ended up fighting each other. Now, although Mindworm reformed, he was exploited by other criminals, and after being released from prison for another time, he became homeless and refused to use his abilities to defend himself for fear of hurting people, so eventually, before Peter Parker could help him, William's life was taken by a street gang, and he hasn't been seen since. Now listen, some villains are just a sign of the times. Asbestos is incredibly heat and fire resistant, and back in the day, we really used to take advantage of the mineral. It was in thousands of products, and it even came into our comic books with the supervillain known as Asbestos Lady, who was fittingly a villain for the original Human Torch, the android Jim Hammond. Victoria Murdoch created herself a costume made entirely of asbestos, which basically made her immune to fire when she wore it. Now, since it is no longer back in the day, we now know that asbestos is actually incredibly carcinogenic. Not only does it cause mesothelioma, but it can also cause a lung disease called asbestosis. Of course, neither the writers of the comics nor the villain herself actually knew that at the time, but that didn't save Victoria, as she eventually did pass away at the age of 45 thanks to idiopathic mesothelioma. Kind of surprisingly, Marvel created Asbestos Man after the fact, a guy known as Orson Karloff, who had no connection to Asbestos Lady other than also wearing an armored suit of asbestos, and he actually survived his cancer but continued wearing the armor, just this time he dragged around an air canister to keep him alive as he did so. He was unwilling to fight anyone, and everyone was afraid to even go near him, which led to an hours-long standoff with the Great Lake Avengers before eventually just surrendering and then apparently dying at a later date, probably from asbestos. Now, Spider-Man has a lot of villains, and a lot of those villains have animal-based names and powers. A lot of these villains are super cool and intimidating. We have Rhino, Dr. Octopus, Vulture, Scorpion, etc, etc, but some of them are just a little bit ridiculous, and possibly the most ridiculous would have to be the Kangaroo. We have had two different kangaroos. The first was Frank Oliver. Frank was an Australian boxer, but not just that. He was an Australian boxer who naturally lived with and grew up among kangaroos. And it was all because he just really liked kangaroos. Now, while living among them, he developed a ridiculously impressive ability to jump, and that is what led him to a career of boxing, which makes no sense to me. When he went to the United States without a passport, he used his ability to jump to both escape custody and to embrace a life of crime, and this led to him fighting Spider-Man. Unfortunately for Oliver, he entered a room containing a dangerous amount of radiation, which actually reduced him to a pile of ash. But don't worry, he was replaced by interior decorator Brian Hibbs, who trained to get a similar jumping ability but also augmented this by donning the most embarrassingly bad kangaroo mech suit I have ever seen in my life. And I haven't seen a lot of kangaroo mech suits, so I don't know of any actually, now that I think about it. Now, I have spoken about the villain Lifeform before, and while I absolutely unironically love this character, I really don't think that Marvel will ever bring him back. But the fun thing is, they totally and very easily could. The son of a fanatical right-wing libertarian saw George trained by his father to prepare him for the world. Although he wanted to be an actor, George was convinced to become a scientist by his father, who also got George a job at Advanced Idea Mechanics, or aim. But his father didn't know that this would inadvertently get George exposed to the pro-gamma virus. This virus mutated George into this grotesque monster, becoming known as the Lifeform. Now Lifeform has superhuman strength, durability, a healing factor, and he can survive in water and the vacuum of space. He even caused Frank Castle the Punisher to run away from him because his weapons had literally no effect on him. Eventually, Frank Castle knocked him into a river with a rocket, but George came back anyways, now with two different personalities. One his normal peaceful self, and the other being the monster Lifeform. George now came into conflict with Daredevil, but this time he was more of a confused monster, and eventually, in an altercation with police, his heart began beating so fast that he just collapsed and then dissolved into a puddle. While he did eventually reform, he was put into battle against the Hulk by the alien Mercy, who also turned him back into an actual human man again. But this wouldn't last, as he remutated and attacked an entire hospital. S.H.I.E.L.D. contacted Mr. Fantastic, who was actually incapacitated at the time, so then the Silver Surfer took George to a dead planet destroyed by Galactus and just left him there, as he couldn't really bring himself to put an end to this guy, but he didn't want to bring him back into society. And that is the last we ever saw of Lifeform. Just out on the remnants of a dead planet, one part of him wanting to just go to the end of time, and the other half growing more and more hungry as he just sits there. Now when it comes to Wolverine, his backstory seems to be a bottomless pit of never-ending inspiration for Marvel writers, but after a while that kind of started to get stale. To prove that point, we are going to talk about Romulus. Romulus was basically another mysterious evil mastermind behind the Weapon X project. He was the one to raise Daken as a ruthless assassin, and he gave Cyber his adamantium skin, and he had been secretly manipulating Logan his entire life. Basically, if you take Sabretooth, give him some salt and pepper hair, tied up in a top knot, with Wolverine-like adamantium claws, and you basically got yourself one Romulus. Romulus claimed that he, Wolverine, Sabretooth, and these other feral-like mutants were a species of human that were descended from wolves instead of apes. But then, that was apparently just a lie used to manipulate Wolverine even more. Logan eventually learned that Romulus's grand scheme was for Logan and Daken to fight to decide who would take Romulus's place at the top of the food chain. And I think it's safe to say that a large majority of readers really just didn't care at all, as his character had a lot to do with a part of Logan's life that we had already closed the books on back in the 90s. Now, our last pick for today even rebranded himself, and it couldn't save him from being a laughingstock. Paste Pot Pete, or Peter Petruski, patented a multi-polymer adhesive that actually led to him becoming very wealthy. But being a complete doofus, instead of actually following that success, Peter decided to instead try and be a supervillain, using his invention to successfully rob a bank. Now following that, Pete decided to level up from robbing banks to stealing a Delta cosmic missile from the military. And thanks to the Human Torch, and the fact that his only thing is super glue, this was a humiliating failure. He quickly became a joke to the superhero community. He even rebranded himself to the Trapster, which is a much better name, but that is completely overshadowed by his time as Paste Pot Pete. The character himself can't even handle being called that anymore. Hearing the name actually causes him to go into a rage and is totally listed as one of his weaknesses on his wiki page. Despite his hilarious past, Trapster has been a recurring villain for years, although he is almost never taken seriously. And that's all she wrote. Thank you guys so much for watching today on Top 10 Nerd. I'm Adam Andrews. I will catch you all on the flippy flop. Until then though, stay safe and peace out, nerds.